why isn't Sumeria or the Sumerians listed on the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10? Who's Nimrod from Genesis chapter 10? The answer to these things depends on who you ask. Now, if you ask the sort of the more literal fundamentalist view of Genesis, they really don't have a good answer for that. The Sumerians, under the traditional view, ought to be on the table of nations if it represents the beginning of every nation on earth, because the Sumerians were in the region, they were old enough. Now, the scholars who have gone, I would say, more secular or take a lower view of the text say, well, that's easy. The Sumerians disappeared from history before Genesis was penned. Genesis was not penned by Moses. Early Genesis was not penned by Moses. It was penned by some priests who said it was written by Moses to sort of gain credibility for the document. And they didn't know about the Sumerians, and that's why they didn't list them on the table of nations. By the time they went into captivity, the Sumerians had long disappeared. And that is a view that is sort of in vogue, and that seems to be a piece of evidence that would support that view. However, that is not the view I take in the Christ-centered model of early Genesis. My view is the fundamentalists are correct about what Genesis is. They are just wrong in what the narrative is saying. It is an historical narrative. The scholars are mistaken about the nature, the very nature of what early Genesis is. But they're incorrect, and they're incorrect because the view of the text, it's actually higher than even the fundamentalists think. Early Genesis somehow, miraculously, is speaking about the work and person of Christ. It's an historical narrative, but it's tracing the seed. It's tracing the promise of Messiah who will crush the serpent's head. Even from Genesis chapter 1, it's speaking of the work and person of Christ. And this, I would say, super high view of the text is the one that Jesus Christ had. Read John 5:46. He said that Moses wrote about him, so much so that if you didn't believe in him, you didn't really believe in Moses either. That's just how much Moses was writing about Christ. But of course, you don't even need to be a Christian to believe the typical fundamentalist view of early Genesis. In fact, they got it from the rabbis who don't believe in Jesus as Messiah. That's the pity of it. That view cannot possibly be right. They can be right about what the text is as far as an historical narrative, as far as inspired by God, but that they cannot be right in what it's saying because their view is pretty much identical with that of the rabbis. And what do we know from Corinthians? Paul was writing, it said, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. They don't understand it. So if your view of the text is taken from them, guess what? It's taken from people that the Bible assures you do not understand it because it's about Jesus, even then. And I've been really reluctant to approach, even though the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel, they're both in the primeval history. They're both a part of early Genesis. They're both a part of what the scholars keep saying, oh, it's not historical. They just sort of adapted some other Mesopotamian legends to their use. And then the sort of the fundamentalist side is saying it is historical, but this is what the history is. It's the same thing the Jews have always said. And I'm saying both sides are wrong. I really, though, the scholars are probably more wrong in that they are being wrong about both what the text is and what it says. The fundamentalists, they're just wrong about what it says because they didn't reinterpret it according to the view of Christ that Moses was writing about him. So I'm reluctant to do this because I've written this 400-page book and I'm peeling back these layers and showing where all the misunderstandings have been piled up on top of one another. And so if I start with this, if I start with near the end in this video, you haven't had all the peeling back of the other layers, and it's too shocking, it's too different to you. But I'm going to give it a try, folks, and I beg of you not to cut me off before you hear me out, even though what I'm going to start with, I'm going to put 400 pages of material and not prove any of it. I'm just going to say where I am here. I prove it in the book. Adam was not the first man. The Bible doesn't teach he was the first man. The Bible teaches he was a figure of Christ, Romans 5:14. There were other people out there. Adam was specially created for what? To bring the line of Messiah into the world, to initiate God's plan to bring Messiah, because he knew how things would turn out. Mankind would need saving. And so Adam wasn't the first man. There's always been the people of God over here and the people that are outside that church or in the world over there. There's always been the gray zone, there's always been the garden, then there's always been the work zone and the world. And so the people of Israel were chosen out from among the descendants of, just like Noah was chosen out. The people of Israel, they were chosen out among the descendants of Adam to bear the line of Messiah. And it came down to the Messiah, and it came into him. But all along the line, people could come into Israel from outside. Foreigners could attach themselves to the nation of Israel and become a part of the nation of Israel. If you even see my video about the Exodus and how many people there were in the Exodus, foreign multitudes, the Bible said that there were a multitude of foreigners that came with them, and they attached themselves to Israel and became a part of Israel. It's always been like that. And that's the way it is when Jesus Christ fulfilled the covenant of Israel and became the one through whom the promises were fulfilled. We can attach ourselves to him and become saved and be a part of that people that is him and in him. So it's a very different version of things where you've got Genesis is the story of this line of Messiah through history. That's what the narrative is about. But on the edges, there's these other people floating around out there, and there's oblique references made to them. So by the time you get to the line of Messiah, by the time you get to the table of nations, you've got the sons of Noah and who their descendants are. And the fundamentalist view is, well, that's everybody on earth. And so there shouldn't be any peoples mentioned that are not a part of those peoples. And then later on we find the Sumerians, and he said, we have no answer. These people are not a part of the table of nations. They're not stated there, and yet they were lost to history about 3,000, 4,000 years ago, lost to history, but we rediscovered them through archaeological finds. And the Christ-centered model has a perfect answer. They were not among the descendants of Noah. They were not one of those people groups, and that's why they're not listed on the table of nations. They don't have to be. But I would go a little further and say that the Bible, it doesn't even really say that the whole world was populated from the sons of Noah. I know people think that it does because our translations are terrible. I think it's Genesis 9:32. Some versions actually say, of these was the earth populated. Terrible translation of that word. It doesn't mean populated. It doesn't mean populated anywhere else in the Bible. The word there is scattered or splattered. It's like if you drop a clay pot and the pieces hit the ground and shoot out and get dispersed. And some translations say dispersed, and that's closer to the real meaning of the word. But it is in no way saying that the entire population was descended from the sons of Noah. It's theology that's not in the Bible. And I know you're going to say, oh, but the flood, it says this in the flood account, says that in the flood account. Guys, believe me, there's an explanation. Or you don't have to believe me. Just assume for the sake of argument here, the text is really saying something different there, and is about the flood is about purifying the line of Messiah, not wiping out the whole world. That the flood is sort of a figure of what? Of baptism. And that's what the New Testament says it is. Well, in baptism, what happens? In baptism, does the unbelieving world get wiped out in a flood? Or do believers get purified and raised to newness of life by what is unclean in them being washed away? That's what baptism is. So baptism was God's people getting purified, what was unclean in them being wiped out, so that what was right in them, what was in faith, could live and live better. But this video isn't about that. It really is about the table of nations and the character of most of these nations, except for some of the sons of Shem. They kept more to themselves. Most of these nations, think of the figures in the Bible. Think of Abraham. He had all these sons, he had all these servants. He had to drive sons away who themselves became the founders of nations. So many people want to attach themselves to his household. He actually was able to raise an army that defeated the kings of 5 cities from his household and his personal associates. Esau raised an army of 400 men when it was time for his showdown with Jacob. Abraham was so powerful, the men of Gerar made a treaty with him as a private individual. And when his son came along, they said to Isaac, look, you're too powerful. Just go away from us, you see. So his household was becoming more of a nation than that city. And I speculate that that's the way it was. When it's listing in the table of nations, these people became the father of these nations. They were not all sons of Adam. They accumulated an entourage like all these other patriarchs in the Bible. And they simply kept them, and those became the core of the new nations. Now, I noticed a very interesting, and I might drop a link to the study in the description section of the video, but I noticed a study on the origin of the Canaanites, and it pretty much confirms what I'm saying here. They say, well, it looks like the Canaanites were a mixture of native peoples in the Levant with admixture from another group that came from Armenia. In other words, came from the region of Mount Ararat and mixed with them and produced what we know as the Canaanites. And in the Table of Nations, it says afterwards were the families of the Canaanites scattered abroad. Abroad from where? Where the ark landed. And there you have it. So it was what I would expect to find if what I'm saying is true. And I really do not have time tonight or most nights to tell you how many little confirmations like that I've found and how much more sense Genesis makes when you see it through the Christ-centered model. So let me turn the assumptions of the scholars on their heads. Let me use the logic that they have on the Sumerians against them. Because what they're saying, the Sumerians are not on the table of nations, and that is evidence that the writer of Genesis didn't know about the Sumerians, and therefore it is not an ancient work. That's the kind of the position or the assumption that they can draw from the material, but that is explained by what I'm saying, that the Table of Nations is a list of the descendants of Noah, and there were people in the world who were not descendants of Noah. That's why they weren't on the list. So I'm going to turn it on their head by bringing up a story called Inmakar and the Lord of Arada. And it is a very, very ancient Sumerian story. Inmakar was probably an historical king in Sumeria. And the tale, as near as they can translate the pieces they have, seems to be a pretty realistic tale. And the shocking thing is, it has many parallels with the Tower of Babel account. Now, I do not think Inmakar is Nimrod. David Roll, there are some people who do think Inmakar is Nimrod. However, he's a Sumerian figure, and I think Nimrod was a Semitic figure because, again, there were other people in the world besides the families of Noah. And one of them produced Nimrod, not the Sumerians. But in this account, And there's controversy in the way it's translated. Either and in one way it's translated, it says the whole universe, and then it further defines the whole universe, and it gives nations that are around the two rivers and adjoining them. So they looked at it as a universe, and that might be a clue in Genesis chapter 11. Do we translate that when it says the whole earth spoke one language? Do we say that was globally, there was one language, or do we say, well, that's a piece of literature, that's an ancient piece of literature written about the same time as In Makar and the Lord of Harada was written, and when they used the whole world, what they meant was these kingdoms that are now, it runs from Syria to Iran, and that's what they mean when they say the whole earth or the whole land is another way to translate that. And also says they were of one tongue and one manner of speech. So the In Makar and the Lord of Harada is sort of pining away for a time when mankind had one tongue and one manner of speech, and hoping that the gods would bring those times back. Now there's some controversy in how these things are translated, but they were pretty surprised at how much, and it was also about him trying to get control of the religious ceremonies and temples, because there was no separation of church and state. The kings ruled on behalf of the gods. They claimed to be gods. And so controlling the temple was controlling the politics. And it ties into everything you're saying about let us build us a city, let us build us a tower. And the idea was they were going to build a temple at the top of the tower. They were going to start a religion and use it like was being done around then to get political influence. And this is what God is afraid of, or the Lord is upset about. He's not afraid of their technological prowess. I doubt the tower even got 150 meters high. What he was afraid of was their evil imagination of daring to start their own religion instead of following him and following the true religion. And that's still really, I think people are still trying to do that today. It hasn't changed since Babel. Even in Revelation, it harkens back to that. But I don't want to go there. What I want to point out is, just like the Sumerians, the tale of In Makar and the Lord of Harada was lost to history. It was lost to history before the Jewish captivity to Babylon. And yet the story of the Tower of Babel contains common elements with that account. So they didn't know about the Sumerians, but they knew about this. How did they know? How did they have their own version of events? One of them is garbled, or one of them is from a slightly different perspective. I wouldn't even say it's garbled. It's looking at it from another side. Okay. But how did they have it? Well, because the assumptions, the premises of the scholars are incorrect. It's not that the Jewish people came to Babylon, they came to the captivity and started borrowing accounts from their captors. Their ancestors were from that region. They had independent accounts of the same events. They had their own perspective on it. It was family history, and that's what Moses was using when he compiled early Genesis. That's how we got the primeval history. So this is an historical account, but an historical account of what? Who was Nimrod, and when did these things occur? And this is what I find fascinating about the tower and about the Table of Nations, because when I'm talking about Adam, and I have somewhat older dates for Adam than you're used to if you're looking at the Masoretic text, maybe even a little older than the Septuagint text of chapter 5 and chapter 11 genealogies. I think the genealogies can only give you a minimum date, and it's too young. The real dates are a little bit further back in history, but not excessively far back. So, but by the time you get to the tower, you are getting to the point where the biblical accounts and traceable human history start to merge. They come together. We see that the inklings of, okay, we're beginning to tie the pages of the Bible, start to become human history, It's all historical narrative, but I'm talking about even the secular world says, yeah, we're connecting it here. This is recognizable as an event in the pages of Scripture. So let's take a look at Nimrod next. So, who is my candidate for Nimrod? It's someone from the Sumerian kings list. You say, but Mark, didn't you just say the Sumerians were not a part of the table nations because they were not descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Yes, but they kept the list of kings for the nearby countries. The Sumerian kings list, one of them, section of them has, as far as the kings after the flood, they have Semitic names. Some of them are just the names of Semitic animals, but they're using Semitic words there. And so they are from the right language group. And when I say Semites or Shemites, really all the sons of Noah would start off that way. Now, I think the text gives us some hints that Japheth, most of the guys from Japheth and their clans, they stayed with the foreigners and divided the nations of the foreigners up as they went across Turkey and into Greece and so forth. And the sons of Ham later went into Africa, I guess after the scattering, but before they were there, but they would be Semitic language too. Assyrian is a Semitic language. Akkadian is the Semitic language. So more than just the Israelites would speak. Semitic is a broader group than what you're probably thinking of. Okay, you say, well, these kings, when were these kings? Well, it says they were after the flood, so it depends on when you think the flood was. Now, there was a big flood in 2900 BC just in that region, and many scholars think that's when the flood was, so they date those kings on the Sumerian kings list after that, more recently than 2900 BC. However, there were other big floods, even bigger, discovered earlier. The fellow named Woolley, he thought he had found the remains of the flood of Noah. He found 4 or 5 meters of sediments. And it could have been a glancing blow of the flood of Noah. I think the actual central point zero of the flood was either further up at the top of Mesopotamia into maybe Turkey or over into Armenia. But they got a big flood much earlier. Now, how much earlier? It's debatable. 3,600 BC, 4,000 BC. I kick it around a little bit in the book, but it's earlier than 2,900 BC. And so I think there were many floods, but the one we're talking about is probably in that time range. Let's say 4,000 BC, somewhere in that neighborhood. And the 12th name on that list, or the 13th name on that list, is one called Etana. And Etana, they do not know if he was a historical figure or not, but they say things about him. They say he consolidated all the foreign lands. They don't say he conquered all the foreign lands. It's not that he used warfare, but he used something, some sort of influence, some sort of guile, some sort of strategy, and consolidated all the foreign lands. He got them together. And doesn't that sound like them saying to one another, let us build us a city? And sort of what Enmakar, who came a little after, sometime after, indeed, if he was an historical figure, Etana, had sort of that same strategy, get control of the temple worship and thus get political control of the cities and form yourself an empire without the incredible wastefulness of war. War is very wasteful and foolish. I'm very sad that even countries that are Christian in their population, their leaders are leading their populations to ruin and to war with each other. There's a better way. And it doesn't say that Nimrod conquered these places, but it said he built an empire. He was the first one to be a mighty one in the earth. And so the earliest sign we have of any historical figure being a mighty man like that is this figure, Etana. We don't know when he lived. I think it was before 2,900 years ago, or 2,900 BC, I should say. based on a flood date that is a little older than what the Septuagint prescribes, but not much. And these names on the list, the Sumerian kings list that I'm talking about, the first kings after the flood, very curious. The first one is Jush-ur. There's several ways to pronounce it, but one of them is Jush-ur. Almost sounds like a derivative of Cush, actually. And then the next 12 names on the list, the longest period they ruled, and I'm not saying that they're translating or the numbers of their reign was accurate, but it's 360 years is the longest listed reign. But the longest of the individual 12 kings was 360. Well, what I think is we're talking about a period of oligarchy here. It's not that there were 12 kings, each of them reigned hundreds of years, and then came Etana, because that would push it earlier than 2900 BC. But I think what we have in here is a period. The second name on the list really translates to all of them were Lord. That Kulasima Bel is the second name on this list. It means all of them were Lord. And so I think the next 12 names on the list is describing an oligarchy that ruled for a period of time equal to the longest period on that list was when the last of the oligarchy went away. And so you have Jush-ur as the first leader or king, and he may have been more of a priestly figure. And then you had this oligarchy ruling, and then you have Etana. And Etana is said to be the one who consolidated all the foreign countries, the first one that we know of in history to be a mighty one in the earth. Now, when do I think all this happened? Well, it turns out that there is a period of time in which there seems to be some empire building, and they refer to it in history as the Uruk expansion. The Uruk expansion is from about 3600 BC to 3000 or 3100 BC. That is the period where it seems like there was a highly expansionistic culture that took over a wide area. And a lot of it was trade networks. A lot of it was soft power. But that's okay, because it doesn't say that Nimrod conquered everything by the sword. He built a kingdom, but it doesn't really say how. So I think they did it with wisdom. And there's a lot wiser, more clever ways to build a kingdom than to use war. When did all this end? From around 3000 or 3100 BC, the Uruk expansion came to a sudden stop. And there was a scattering of people. And not only was there one city that was not being built, but generally across that region, people left off building cities and scattered. In other words, what is described in the Bible account is what happened in that region from about 3000 or 3100 BC at the sudden end of the Uruk expansion. So is that where our archaeologists and our historians catching something from the Bible happening in action? I believe so. And it's happening just a little bit earlier than those who take a very rigid view of the genealogies take. But see my video on why an usher-like interpretation of the videos is wrong. It's going to give you a date that's a little too young. At any rate, I go into the book. I go into more details in the book. I don't want to take the time to do it here. But there is a good candidate for Nimrod. If you look at it through the Christ-centered model, these things that make no sense, the lack of Sumerians in the Table of Nations, and yet we have an older account that we thought was lost in Enmakar and the Lord of Arada that has Tower of Babel type themes in it, and that we have a good candidate for Nimrod and the things that happened historically match what we see in the Babel account. If you just look at it through the Christ-centered model and take the sort of the time frames that are listed there, and most importantly, take a view of the world that's listed there. Genesis is it's not talking much about the origin of mankind. It's talking a lot about the line of Messiah and following the development and the narrative of the line of Messiah through history. I do thank you for listening, and may God bless you.